Hi everyone, we are going to start talking about genetics today. We're going to introduce basic Mendelian genetics and Punnett squares, and then maybe talk about some of the complex inheritance patterns if we have a little bit of time. So first, you may or may not remember a man named Gregor Mendel. He was a monk, considered the father of genetics, but he's famous for his experiments with pea plants. And the reason why he chose pea plants was because they were easy to grow and he could produce a lot of offspring in a very short period of time, which allowed him to study large quantities of these traits and then applied the ideas of probability to predicting what he could expect in future crosses with these plants. Now, the one thing about pea plants, another thing why they were easy to study, was because they came in a wide variety of traits that were considered either or traits. So the plants were either tall or short. The seeds were either round or wrinkled. The pods were either yellow or green. The flowers were either white or purple. And this made it real nice and easy for him to figure out what trait was possibly dominant, what trait was recessive, etc. Now, the terms that we apply to modern genetics, like dominant, recessive, alleles, genes, these are terms that Mendel himself did not use. In fact, he called the traits of the pea plants factors. And he just simply made notice that when he crossed two particular plants, some of the factors showed up in the subsequent generations and some didn't. And then again, he applied the mathematical probability to figure out why this was happening. Now, another thing you want to remember is this idea of independent assortment. And the gizmo that you were working with on meiosis spoke a little bit about this. And this has to do with the fact that alleles for the same trait separate independently from each other, and genes separate independently for one another for the most part, okay? All right, in terms of traits, so genetics is the study of how traits are passed down from parent to offspring. We could also call this inheritance, right? When we talk about inheritance patterns, we're talking about how traits are passed down from parent to offspring. And here's some photos of some very simple traits that you can look at yourself. Do you have the ability to roll your tongue? Do you have dimples? Maybe you have freckles. Do you have a cleft chin? Do you have curly hair, straight hair, wavy hair? It doesn't matter what organism we're talking about. All of those physical characteristics that we can see, we call a trait. Now, remember that traits are determined by a gene that happens to be on a chromosome. Chromosomes are made of DNA, so a gene is a segment of DNA that determines a trait. Now, in particular, if we want to be more specific about that, a gene is a segment of DNA that carries instructions for making a particular protein. And it is the function of that protein that is what is determining the trait. Also, chromosomes come in homologous pairs. We also talked about this in meiosis. So a homologous pair of chromosomes are chromosomes that are of the same size, the same shape, and they contain the same genes. They just may come in different versions, and those different versions being alleles. Now remember, we as humans have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. We received 23 of those chromosomes in a sperm cell from dad, and 23 of the chromosomes in an egg cell from mom. So let's take a look at a pair of homologous chromosomes. So here's a pair of homologous chromosomes. We could assume that one came from mom, one came from dad. The gene for eye color is being highlighted on this chromosome. And you can see that one chromosome is expressing or carrying the allele for having blue eyes, and the other chromosome is carrying the allele for having brown eyes. Again, eye color is the gene, but the two different versions of that eye color are what we consider to be alleles. So you could do this for any of the common traits we want to talk about. Dimples, let's say. There would be, dimples would be the gene, and either having dimples or not having them would be the two different alleles. You could say the same thing for hair color, right? Hair color being the gene, but you have brown hair, black hair, red hair, blonde hair. All of these things are different allele combinations for the same gene. So let's talk about these genes here in dominant and recessive terminology. So a dominant gene is a gene that typically prevents another gene from showing, another gene from being able to show the outcome of the protein that it's supposed to make. We refer to those as dominant genes. Genes that do not show up, even though they're present, and this is actually, these are genes that don't show up when a dominant gene is present. These are called recessive genes. The traits of a recessive gene are often hidden or masked when a dominant gene is present. How do we represent these? Well, dominant genes are represented by an uppercase letter. In this case, we're using a capital T, and recessive genes are represented by lowercase letters. In this case, a lowercase t. Now, the letter that we choose is arbitrary. It's not always a letter T. Typically, we choose a letter that represents the gene that we're talking about. So if we're using eye color, maybe we use a letter E. If we're talking about freckles, maybe we use a letter F. The letter itself is not important. What's important is that we make sure we associate dominant genes with uppercase letters and recessive genes with lowercase letters. So let's take an example here. Hitchhiker's thumb. And you guys can check this out to see if you have this or not, right? You can give yourself a big thumbs up, and you can take a look at your thumb from a profile perspective from the side, and you can see, does it curve backwards, right? Does it have a curve, a bend to it, or does it stay straight? No matter how hard you try to maybe make that curve happen, it just doesn't. So having that curve, so this guy over here is a hitchhiker's thumb, and not having it, we consider that straight. Now in this case, having a straight thumb is the dominant trait, so we assigned a capital T to it, and having a hitchhiker's thumb is a recessive trait, so we assigned a lowercase t for it. Now, how do we rate this? Well, if you have a straight thumb, there are two, remember, you have to receive two alleles for every trait that you have, right? Because they're coming in homologous pairs. So that means that mom is giving you an allele for hitchhiker's thumb, and dad is giving you an allele for hitchhiker's thumb. It's the way those two alleles act together that determines your phenotype, whether or not you're going to have a hitchhiker's thumb or a straight thumb. So here, if you had a straight thumb, if I highlight this, if you have a straight thumb, there are two possible allele combinations that you inherited from a parent. You may have gotten a dominant allele from both parents, or you may have received a dominant allele from one parent and a recessive allele from another. Both of these, because the dominant allele is present, are going to mean that you have a straight thumb. The only way that you can have a hitchhiker's thumb is if you received two recessive alleles. So both parents gave you a recessive allele. In order to express a recessive trait, you need to have both recessive alleles present. All right, when both genes of a pair are the same, for instance, are two capital T's, we say that those individuals are homozygous or purebred. Purebred or pure breeding mean the same thing. It just means that you have two of the same alleles for a trait. If you happen to have two dominant alleles, you are homozygous dominant. If you happen to have two recessive alleles, you are homozygous recessive. So homozygous just means having two of the same alleles for a gene. If you've inherited one dominant and one recessive gene for a trait, then you are heterozygous, hetero for a mix. Another term that expresses heterozygous is hybrid. And you can see here, capital T, lowercase t, having one of each, one dominant, one recessive allele, this is heterozygous. Now, individuals that have at least one copy of the dominant gene, so whether you are homozygous dominant or heterozygous, over here express the dominant trait, which in this case is having black fur. Individuals that are homozygous recessive, having two copies of a recessive allele, show the recessive trait, which is white fur in this case. Add another layer of terminology. The homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous terminology are what we consider an organism's genotype. So here's genotype. A genotype is the actual combination of genes or the actual combination of alleles that an organism has. So having two dominant alleles, having a dominant and a recessive, or having two recessive. These are the genotypes. What is the allele combination of the organism? Genotype determines phenotype. Phenotype is an organism's physical appearance. It is the result of the genotype. So in this case, if we go back to our hitchhiker's thumb, remember, was recessive. So if you were a homozygous recessive individual, right here, homozygous recessive, you would have a hitchhiker's thumb. If you have a straight thumb, you could be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous.